Hi there, and welcome to my part of my website here. We call Teaching with Text. So, kind of advice for teachers on how to incorporate different historical texts into their teaching. And this week, I want to be talking about Rebecca Clifford's Survivors. So, her recent book that came out in 2020 around child survivors of the Holocaust, which is actually a finalist for the Kundil Prize and also the Wolfson Prize for history. So yeah, very much a timely book in that sense. So what I want to try and do is sort of walk you through how you might incorporate this book into different elements. What could you kind of pull out of it and use in your teaching? Okay, so you might also be sort of first thinking kind of what more could be written about the Holocaust. Obviously, it's an incredibly well-resourced historical epoch, era. And on first seeing this, you might think, well, actually, what can we do? So stories of children's, but it's actually absolutely fantastic history book. It just draws out so many incredible themes that you, as a teacher, could explore in your classroom. So the key one, I suppose, is in a sense, and something that Dr. Clifford really focuses in on, is a sense of historical memory, and kind of walks us through that through the stories of these child survivors of the Holocaust. So it's done fairly chronologically, so it's very, very easy to follow. So, for example, she uses many primary sources and lots of kind of examples of how the war affected children. So for example, page 60 here, she's got a case of a young man called Robert. The idea and him kind of trying to kind of get out of Europe. So for this early part of the book, she really draws out the chaos and the dislocation that so many people encountered in the summer of 1945 and into 1946, and obviously, I suppose, the vulnerability of children in that situation, more so than perhaps adults. And again, a lot of, obviously, she's focusing on often quite young children as well. So those, who may be only, less than 10 years of age. And she get through these various kind of vignettes that she gives over the first sort of quarter, fifth of the book, really builds up a very rich portrait of in terms of the different experiences. So they're very they're unique, obviously, to that particular person. So in your teaching, it'd be very useful to lift those. It could be really useful extracts to use as maybe a starter activity, or incorporating them into some sort of broader inquiry that your students could look at. And because they're only usually running to a couple of pages, and most of the language would be accessible, certainly for Key Stage 4 students, teenagers, MYP if you're teaching IB, and also with some differentiation, helping younger students in that sense. So, but I think as well, I think it would really help a connection, a kind of sort of historical empathy in that sense of connecting for your students in class, in terms of what these kids in the past actually went through. So it is really, and from those sort of individual vignettes, but also pulling out from that, Dr. Clifford pulls out these broad themes in the sense of as I said, like the dislocation, the chaotic nature of how these kids across Europe found themselves, how they've been sort of traumatized by war, they've been shifted around from pillar to post during the war, they had to conceal their identity, which again is one of the key things that comes out as Dr. Clifford kind of looks at this sense of historical memory and how it's evolved, is the struggle with identity that these kids have had to deal with throughout their lives, but at the early part of the book, kind of looking at the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, and kind of with that sense of kind of identity as well. Like if I just draw, she gives, if we move on here to page 69, looking again at, in page 69 here, kind of looking again at how different agencies as well. So you've got this real kind of gamut of agencies that are involved in trying to extract kids, well, find them in the first place, these survivors, potential survivors of the Holocaust, and then actually extract them. And this, and in this sort of part of the book now, Dr. Clifford really kind of drills down into the sort of the competition almost between these agencies to sort of save these kids and how to get them out, where they should go. So some moving to the UK, for example, others to Canada, to Australia, other countries. And again, how, what I really like that Dr. Clifford does through these particular primary accounts is show the agency of the kids as well. So that's a really interesting thing to explore within the history classroom. Is often there's a tendency, when students look back on the past, is not to give those historical characters agency. It doesn't happen all the time, but it's fairly frequent. And I think that happens particularly when we look at children in the past. There's often a tendency to think that there's no kind of, agency in a sense. And again, through the book, Dr. Clifford really sort of draws out that no, they did have agency, especially some of the older kids, the pre-teens and the teenagers as well, in terms of making decisions over their lives as they try to readjust to the sort of the new normal in the chaotic aftermath of the Second World War. So kind of with that in mind, as we move through again, through this sort of earlier part of the book, on here, for example, page 75, she's then looking at specific examples of, again, various, you've got Zionist organisations, you've got Canadian Jewish Congress, for example. Here she talks about Jewish Congress's Australian Jewish Welfare Society. So it really brings a kind of international flavour to this issue here of, what was to become of these thousands of child survivors at the end of the war. So that's kind of the first part of the book. So there's lots there that I think could be drawn out in terms of, as I said, identity, agency of sort of, people in the past. And again, there's lots of, as I said, sort of little extracts that could easily be used and incorporated into your lessons. Moving on as well, as we go through the book, and then as sort of chronologically, Dr. Clifford goes through into the post-war world, more so into the post-war world in a sense. She really brings to the fore, really kind of explores how we get the kind of changing historiography, how the Holocaust and the Holocaust's memory actually becomes history in a sense. And obviously mostly through the kind of the prism of these experiences of young people during that time. And also the issues that they have and the presumptions that are made upon them in terms of what they ought to remember and what they ought to represent as well. So again, it really so much you can kind of draw out of or from kind of identity, and in terms of how history is constructed, how historical memory is constructed in terms of for individuals, obviously for groups and for nations in a sense. So for example, here she talks about the West German Federal Compensation Law of 1956 and the sort of consequences that brings. And that's the fascinating part of the book. So that's in kind of page 158, around that sort of time. And drawing out in the sense of, this is one of the first points really where the trauma, if you like, that these kids have experienced is really starting to be brought to the fore. There's a sort of, people are more conscious of it in a sense. And in a way, which was something I didn't know actually, which she described later on, is the fact that this idea of trauma that we're, and post-traumatic stress disorder and things like this, that we're very kind of, this common currency now and we're very aware of it, was unknown at this time. So I found that absolutely riveting to see that. And she brilliantly kind of draws out how, almost by trial and error, and in a sense kind of accidentally, there's suddenly this realization that there's hundreds of kids, or thousands of kids actually, dealing with the trauma of having been caught up in these hugely historically significant events of the Second World War. And again, this law, the West German Federal Compensation Law, actually draws people out to seek compensation. So then doctors notice these sort of these themes, these sort of medical conditions, depression, things like that, that are consistent amongst all or many of the people coming forward who are now kind of young adults, but were kind of children or teenagers at the time at the end of the war. So again, that's another theme that you could draw out or make kind of cross-curricular links potentially as well. So that's that kind of part of the book, and then kind of moving on from there, which again, Dr. Clifford does brilliantly, is in a sense of really kind of looking at how this idea of kind of historical, or as I said, like how the Holocaust has become, or how it was constructed to become historical memory. And in a sense, it sort of sits quite well with other books that have come out in the recent years. For example, Mary Fulbrook's Reckonings, looking at that actually, a lot of the history of the war, in a sense, and the trauma that people suffered was kind of suppressed for quite a long time through the 50s and 60s, certainly kind of in Europe. And it's really kind of later on, as we move into the 70s and into the 80s, as this generation gets older, that start to actually revisit the past. So she, again, back here on page 227, she, a really interesting part here, looking at a sense of actually, testimony. So nowadays we're very confident, and I'm sure many teachers use the idea of testimony in their classrooms. So this book is very good, I think, at kind of adding another perspective to that in terms of looking at how it became seen as testimony. And she sort of here kind of illustrates the sort of, I suppose, the formalization of what was kind of expected to be heard from people who had survived the Holocaust. And in these pages here, she brilliantly explores the sense of how those expectations of interviewers often constrained the stories, or constrained the testimony and the witness testimony that these survivors had, because these expectations, especially, and again she highlights the fact that these expectations were particularly pronounced because when people were interviewing survivors who had been children, they're presuming that they've forgotten parts of it, and a lot of the time they were focusing on the war. So for many of the kids, actually their sort of trauma was post-war in a sense, and the sense of identity, or gaps, huge gaps in their sense of self, because they'd been hidden during the war, or they'd actually had very scant recollection of being with their parents. And by the time the war was over, for example, again going back in the early part of the book, Dr. Clifford brings a lot of these out, as I said, these sort of vignettes, in a sense of kids who now by the end of the war couldn't speak the same language as their parents and didn't really know their parents. So again, that sort of psychological trauma and issues kind of emanating from that she sort of explores here. And yeah, just really, really good in terms of this shifting historical memory in that sort of sense. And she really highlights it, wonderfully. And so maybe we just end on that, I think, very powerfully, because one of the people that she interviews as part of the book, in a sense, and again, these are often they're obviously pseudonyms that are used for the people she interviews, is called Leora, who has no recollection, no evidence whatsoever of the first sort of 5-6 years of her life. It doesn't even know her real name. And I thought that was incredibly powerful in that. I mean, even Dr. Clifford says at the end, the two of them at the end, because of this, the science is so weighty, the sort of burden of the absence of evidence in that sense actually, means they both kind of break down and sob, basically, which I really, found very, very moving. And again, it again, something you could draw out in classroom in terms of identity, the damage that does to somebody psychologically if they can't actually go back. I suppose the foundation part of our lives when we're kind of growing up, and again, from some of the other kind of survivor accounts, she talks about how people have, they've tried to go back to piece together their childhood. So I thought that in itself could be an interesting sort of classroom activity, looking at how do we, because often we can do that, can't we, as a way of introducing students to kind of how do we find out about the past, by getting them to actually construct their own past, looking back at, their first sort of 12, 14 years of life. And, so it mirrors that quite well in a sense, because she actually talks to people who've actually done that for real, because they actually can't remember the first, there are no photos, or there's very, very scant, archival, actual physical evidence of what that life was like for them, you know, how they pieced together their own individual memory. So again, very, very powerful themes that could be brought out within the classroom. And yeah, see that sort of changing over time. So all in all, absolutely fantastic book, and you know, lots and lots of themes, as I hope I've sort of touched upon here, that could easily be kind of drawn upon and used by teachers in the classroom. So yeah, here it is, absolutely fantastic book. So yeah, go ahead and use it.